average nurse practitioner makes $137,000 a year. So even if you hire part-time, you're looking at $70,000 in labor costs. Now, most practice owners assume that with that increase in labor costs is going to be an even larger increase in revenues and profits. But what they don't account for is whether their current pricing structure actually supports that provider on payroll, as well as what's going to happen to their cash flow while they're still trying to fill this provider's schedule. And that gap between what they're actually paying this provider and what that provider is really generating in profit is where the $70,000 mistake is. And today we're going to make sure that you don't make it. I'm Chelsea, and I'm a CPA for med spas and other private medical practices. And I have a client, we'll call her B, and she came to me wanting to hire, and she is an aesthetic practice owner, so her focus is on injectables and laser treatments. And she was in the building phase of her practice, so she's a sole proprietor, and she was paying herself weekly through an owner's distribution. So at first glance, when we looked at her profit and loss statement, it looked great. She was at 60% gross profit margin and over 20% net profit margin, which both of those things look really healthy. So just looking at first glance at her profit and loss statement, you would think, oh, okay, this looks really good. Yeah, you should be able to hire another provider. But that's where you can run into an issue, okay? Because she's a sole proprietor, her owner's distributions aren't showing up on that profit and loss statement. They're showing up on the balance sheet because they're not actually being run through a traditional payroll process. They're not treated as an expense. So those are not included in your profit and loss statement. So if you're a sole proprietor, you really need to watch that and take into account your true net profit because there's labor in there. At the end of the day, that 60% gross margin was what her gross margin was, not including labor, okay? Materials only, which means if we add a provider in there, we're gonna be significantly less than where we need to be to still have enough money left over to cover our overheads and leave a profit. So when you're a sole proprietor, what shows up on your profit and loss isn't truly profit. You need to understand what you're actually looking at in those reports, especially when you're going to make major decisions like hiring. This is the first place that $70,000 mistake starts, not in the hiring decision itself, but in misreading the financial picture before going into it. Now, if your books aren't set up to give you any kind of gross profit visibility in the first place, that's where you're really going to want to start. And I do have a DIY bookkeeping cheat sheet that includes a chart of accounts that's built specifically for private medical practices and med spas and in how you do business. So if you need that, the link is below. But stay with me here, because even if you adjust for what's actually going on in your practice versus what your profit and loss is showing you, there's an even deeper layer we need to dig into before you make any major decisions here. Okay, so I have another client, and we'll call her F, and she's a telehealth weight loss provider, and she came to me with the same situation. She's wanting to hire another nurse practitioner, and she's wanting to make sure that she can afford to do it, and all of her numbers support this decision, which is a great thing to come and make sure that all these numbers are in alignment with what you want to do before you make that decision. So we're looking at everything, and her profit and loss statement looked pretty good. You know, overall revenues were fantastic, actually. She had her marketing really down, but profit was a little thin. So then looking further and digging in, we looked at her profitability at the treatment level. So we're looking at each treatment and the costs associated with providing it and making sure that her gross profit margin supports hiring another provider to provide each of these treatments. And when we dug into that, we found that her membership program didn't support that. And her membership made up a huge proportion of her overall revenues. So if she would have brought on another provider and paid them to deliver that membership program, she would have been losing money. So I want you to keep in mind that profit isn't just an overall number. You really need to look at it at the treatment level, because some of the margins on your most popular treatments might not be what you think they are. And that becomes especially important as you're considering hiring another provider to provide those treatments going forward. And you're going to actually have to pay those labor costs. If my client would have hired before we would have done that evaluation, she would have really gotten in a bind. So I want you to always remember, we are looking at gross margin by treatment before making a hiring decision and making sure that we're considering both labor costs and the cost of all of our consumables, your pharmaceuticals, your lab costs, any supplement costs, anything that is a cost directly tied with providing that service, you include that and make sure that your margins really support that hire. Hiring when you have thin margins doesn't create profit. It actually amplifies the problem that already exists. Okay, but stay with me here, because even with the right margins, there is a window between when you hire that provider and when that provider starts actually generating a profit that most practice owners don't even plan for. In my fractional CFO days, I had a client come to me in a full cash crunch. Now, this was an aesthetics and wellness practice owner, so she offered both aesthetics, injectables, and laser treatments, as well as weight loss and HRT. So when she came to me, she was already full-time in her practice and she had hired a second provider. Now, by the time she came to me, she was at a point where she couldn't afford to pay that second provider and still take a paycheck herself. So she wasn't paying herself. Now, when she made this decision, her revenues were strong and she felt like she really needed the provider and that supported the decision. But what she hadn't accounted for was the time between when she hired that provider and when that provider would start actually generating a profit and cash flow to cover that provider's salary. And she didn't have enough cash reserves to get her through this period of time. Hiring a provider is not an instant revenue generating event. There's always this training period, this period of time, and it's usually 60 to 90 days between when you hire this provider and when they start generating revenue. So if a nurse practitioner makes on average $137,000 a year, and let's say you hire them part-time, that's a $70,000 salary that you're supporting before they've ever generated a dollar in revenue. Before you hire, you really need to have two things in place. The first is a working lead generation system. Okay, your marketing needs to be on point and support filling that provider's schedule as quickly as possible. The second thing that you need is at least 3 months of operating expenses, including that new provider's salary, sitting in cash reserves. You need to have enough financial cushion there on hand to get you through this 60 to 90 day training period before that provider starts actually generating enough revenue, profit, and cash flow to cover their own salary. And if either of those things is missing, the timing just isn't right yet. You need to build up and have both of those things in place before you hire. This $70,000 mistake isn't always just a single bad decision. Sometimes it's just a timing problem because the right hire at the wrong time can do just as much damage as the wrong hire altogether. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Hiring can be one of the most exciting growth moves you make in your practice, but it's also one of the most financially risky. You need to make sure that you understand exactly what your profit and loss is telling you, that your profit margins by treatment support the hire, and also that your cash reserves and your lead generation system support that training period. If you do this work up front, hiring becomes a confident decision and not an expensive one. Okay, in the next video, we are getting super specific. I'm going to show you exactly how to calculate whether your prices support a new hire using 3 very specific treatment examples so that you can run the same numbers in your practice.